Hello all and welcome back. This is going to be the lecture for Macroeconomics Chapter 7 on economic growth. Again, I'll give you a second to sort of open up your notes from the files page so that you could follow along in the notes. I would suggest you read this chapter because a lot of this lecture is going to be based on my own research and other research that's out there. We'll touch a lot on the chapter, but there's going to be a lot more in the lecture. So we're going to start moving on from me sort of holding your hand through the exams and the lectures, and it's going to get a little more difficult over time, all right? So stick with it. Y'all are doing great. And here we go, economic growth. So section 7.1 is a description of economic growth at the national level, being a relatively recent arrival on the world scene. Growth didn't really exist until the Industrial Revolution. The idea of the state in many places barely even existed until the Industrial Revolution. And so once the idea of sovereignty and the state and sort of everyone all pushing in the same direction, in addition to the efficiencies derived from the Industrial Revolution, sort of converged, at that point we saw not only do the leaders of states now see a need for growth to increase so that they could increase their tax coffers, but the possibility for growth actually increased because now people are able to profit off of their labor. They're able to focus on specific tasks, become hyper efficient, and then we can expand that hyper efficiency to the economy at large. So we're going to touch on the macroeconomic class is a little bit more politically touchy, I would say, than the microeconomics class. So some of this stuff we'll talk about will be stuff from the news, stuff from just political arguments. I will try to present it as evenly as possible. We have about 1 billion to 1.5 billion people on Earth living in what the UN describes as extreme poverty. This means you're surviving on less than $2 per day as an individual. And that would come out to, $730 per year, so long as it's not a leap year. $730 annually is not a lot, right? And so there are approximately 1 to 1.5 billion people on this earth living in those conditions. And if you're interested in some of the more recent research on poverty reduction, both at the international or the national level and also at the individual level, I would suggest if you're really interested in the sort of the international broad perspective, check out the research by Jeffrey Sachs, who created what's called the Millennium Development Goals. These were some goals that Jeffrey Sachs and the United Nations were hoping that we would hit by the new millennium, the year 2000. We're not doing great, okay? It's been 21 years since. We still haven't accomplished many of those goals. This is difficult, I understand, but at least to try to get an understanding of what the UN is trying to do and trying to accomplish in reducing global poverty, I think that's a really good place to start. And then if you want to look more at sort of the individual level and how do we actually go about reducing poverty at the very micro level, I would suggest that you look at the research of Esther Duflo from MIT University, who was recently awarded the Nobel Prize along with her partners. They do very on-the-ground realistic experimentation in trying to determine how to reduce poverty at the local level, the village level, the family level, even the individual, the matriarch of the home or what have you. Some really brilliant research that introduced some very new concepts to the ideas where everyone was thinking very theoretically. Esther Duflo and her team came in and said, look, man, none of this is actually working. We need to do some real research on the ground. And we really need to have a better understanding of how this stuff works. And we need to be tracking it for individuals, not at the state level, right? And so they have some really cool research out there. And if you'd like to listen to a little snippet from the Harvard Business Review with Esther Duflo and about her research, I've added a link here. So really interesting stuff. I would also say if anyone is looking for information on how a developing country can become developed, which is a question I've been asked by quite a few of my international students in the past, who were looking to bring back knowledge to their home country about trying to develop their state in particular. I would look at Japan or South Korea as the archetypes or the models for this behavior. Africa has been disastrous. Latin America has been a little better. The Asian nations in general have been the best. And this is, we'll talk a little bit about this, but this has been because of a combination of things. First of all, their investment back into their people through infrastructure, education, and healthcare. But it has also been about their economic philosophy, where Africa and South America followed a philosophy of import substitution, is what it's called, ISI, import substitution industrialization. What the main thrust behind the philosophy in South America and Africa was that we want to replace all of the products that are being sold to us from afar, all of these intermediate and developed goods, so computers, cars, things like this. And we want to develop these products for our own internal markets to sell to our people, so that we're not just sending our money afar, right? That was an abject failure. It went really poorly almost across the board. The other philosophy from South Korea and Japan and others, Vietnam, Malaysia, Philippines, a bunch of the Asian states, South Korea especially though, was export industrialization. So instead of trying to rebuild markets and replace all of the products that are being imported from foreign nations, instead they said, all right, clearly there's a vast appetite for products out there in the rich countries. So instead of trying to build all our own internal market, what we'll do is build factories that can provide goods for the rich nations. And hopefully we can work our way through sort of the bottom level development. So this would be, say, children's toys, really simple products, to intermediate level products. We're talking, maybe like a bicycle or televisions. And then eventually, once we get our economy and our people and our urbanization and all of this up to snuff, we'll start moving toward those finalized products. And now we're going to start selling cars and computers and digital cameras. And so they worked their way through an evolution of products and industries to push products to the foreign market, and that is in complete contrast to like I said, the import industrialization substitution of the African and South American economies, which were trying to just build their own internal economy and sort of stick to themselves, right? That was generally across the board disastrous. It even led to a lot of like protests and coups by the military. Whereas on the other side, you've seen a remarkable shift toward the first world. But politically, it also has meant, as we talked about in the curve sort of talk from Bosch and Carl's from the last lecture, the quick richening, I guess, of the Asian nations has also led to a disregard for democratization. And so a lot of the Asian nations that became rich quickly, they haven't seen a need to democratize. They've largely remained autocratic, one-party states, and you're even seeing sort of a reversion toward that in some of these states like Thailand or the Philippines under Rodrigo Duterte, who's a pretty horrible dude. So this money also has a flip side politically, in that it's allowed these leaders to sort of buy off maybe, or keep happy their citizens because they're developing so quickly and they're doing such great things for the standard of living in their nation, that people just trust them to move on with the project. We don't really need democratization. We don't necessarily need self-government. As long as you keep taking care of us and this growth pattern continues, we're going to be placated. We'll be submissive to the state. So it's a very interesting argument about the effects of this sort of thing too, where in East Asia we saw a massive and very rapid increase in standard of living. In Africa and South America we didn't, but those countries have generally become democratic, if not corrupt, but still democratic. So an interesting thing to think about. Okay, that was a lot for the intro, right? So we're going to move on now to this economic growth has only really existed since the Industrial Revolution. This idea, it's only been about 2 centuries since state growth has existed. And I'd love to talk to you a little bit about the history of economic systems and sort of how we got to where we are today. So much of the economic systems pre-Industrial Revolution long ago were agrarian and feudal, basically, where you basically lived in indentured servitude. If you were one of the 95% of normal people, you lived in indentured servitude. You rented out the land from a feudal lord, and you paid taxes through some portion of your crop for the year. You just have to hope that there's not some devastating disease or locusts or a drought or whatever, because then you're screwed. And now, you owe a free year to your feudal lord, and you'll never pay it back. And so we all know how that goes, right? That's sort of the system. And then the feudal lord bumps up some of his as a tax to like the king, in exchange for the king allowing him to rule over this portion of the land or whatever. That's feudalism. At the same time, there were really small groups of communalism, and this is not communism in the sense of sort of the Russian state in the USSR or Pol Pot or Mao Zedong. This is communalism, the idea that we're all going to band together and we're all going to share crops or whatever. So you're still not really getting efficiencies from focusing on a single task or object or production, but at least no one's taxing you, and if you die, you all die together, I guess. Who knows? But that's another sort of way of running. And these are very, very small. This is sort of at like the tribal level. You can't really you didn't really see this at high levels, right? Or large aggregations of social geography. Then we move into sort of mercantilism. And this is, excuse me, this is the precursor to colonialism, basically. This is the idea that we're expanding. We're going to build a navy, and we're going to go out and find foreign lands and steal their stuff. Basically, we want to go down to South America and steal all the gold and the silver, and sort of bolster our own coffers. there wasn't a whole lot of point to it, really, because it just sort of sat in the queen or the king's castle. It didn't really go to the people. It wasn't really going toward investment in human capital or investment in infrastructure. It wasn't being used, if you understand what I'm saying. So even though we're sort of expanding our economy at this point through mercantilism, through basically theft of indigenous people, it still isn't being invested, and we're still not seeing any growth. Okay, the only investments they're really making are in expanding their military and expanding their shipping industry, right? So that they can go out and steal more stuff. That's not helpful overall, right? That's not increasing anyone's standard of living generally, except for the kings and the guy who's, Ponce de Leon, the guy out there who's leading the thieves of the indigenous, I guess. So you still are not seeing a lot of growth. Last, we have mercantilism sort of starts to transfer into colonialism. The leaders start to say, "Hey, why are we just taking shipping expeditions to these places? Why don't we just conquer them? And then we can extract the resources all the better, And we can also force them to buy our crap." And so that's where you get sort of the opium wars in China and these sorts of things where Britain knows opium is a drug, and it knows it's addictive, and it knows the horrible effects it has, and yet it thinks, well, we can extract resources from the Chinese. It forces the Chinese to buy their opium. But again, they're not really investing. They are building small units of infrastructure, and so in Africa, say, they'll try to extract resources like gold or oil or things of this sort, but they're not investing in infrastructure at large or in urbanization in general or increasing plumbing or building roads or bridges or this sort. All they're doing is building a singular, centralized town for the colonialists to make it easier to extract stuff. So it's not helping the larger picture, right? It's not helping Africans to develop. It's not really even helping the British to develop. They do sort of start to get a little bit better standard of living because there are so many people involved in the military and the colonial project. But growth isn't really happening across the world, right? And they're just, again, they're building more military stuff to fight off other competitors in colonialism and to control the populations that they have conquered, right? So that they don't rise up and murder them all, as happened quite a few times. Then, finally, we start to see the Industrial Revolution and the transition into trying to make human labor more efficient, trying to increase technological advances, and investing in further growth so that we can compound and expand the standard of living for everyone in our society. So that's a short, brief history of the types of, I guess, the leading economic structures of the time, right? So we're going to move on to section 7.2, labor productivity and economic growth. Labor productivity is the value that each employed person creates per unit of input. And you just need to know that there's three determinants of labor productivity. These are human capital, that's basically education or training. Technological change, this is research, is one piece of it, what the book calls invention. And then innovation, which is taking that research and that informational advances and turning them into something marketable, right? Turning it into an actual product. So there's two steps to technological change. Most of it is driven on the the research side by universities and the government, and by some private research, right? If you think about like Google or Alphabet, or if you think about the pharmaceutical companies, there are industries that absolutely have to have research going constantly so they can outcompete their competitors, right? But the government and the university system through the government also provides a lot of research. And this research tends to predate the actual technological innovations in products, the market side, by usually 5 to 10 years. There has been research that come out lately in the last 10 years or so since the ubiquitous expansion of the internet, saying that this lag between research side and product side is shrinking, and that the research side from the universities are becoming products or marketable in much less time than it used to take for the market to catch up on the research. That's happening a lot faster these days, supposedly, at least by the research I've seen. And then the third piece, again, the first piece, human capital, is education and training. The second piece is technological change. A is research, B is turning that research into a product, something marketable. And then the third piece of the determinants of labor productivity is the economy of scale, right? The more that we want to produce, I shouldn't even say that. There's an equilibrium point where it'll actually cost me less in inputs per product that I want to find, so that I can take full advantage of the economy of scale, right? Instead of buying 1,000 nails, if I'm in a furniture company, I want to buy 200 million nails, and I can save 45% per nail, that sort of thing. Let's see. They talk about the aggregate production function. This is just a way to visualize the pieces that go into GDP, right? Your workforce, your human capital, your physical labor, your technology, all of these things are tied into creating GDP. And then in the B, all of these are tied into creating GDP per capita. Some really interesting things that they pointed out in figure 7.3. You see the output in the United States per hour worked from 1947 to 2011. So there are few vicissitudes on this graph, right? There's very little downward movement. This is basically, of course there are small bumps, but productivity has increased dramatically in the last 50 years. Unfortunately, if you look at the graph below, which is from the Economic Project, productivity has increased since 48, it looks like, is their start. So this is just post-war. 1948 to 2020, we've seen a 250% increase in productivity per labor hour. So that means for every hour worked, we have 250% more productivity than we did 50 years ago. Unfortunately, pay has not followed that. And so if you look at the chart, the hourly compensation, it seems like it moved at around 1978 or 1979. So this is the stagflation period of the end of not Richard Nixon. This is the end of Jimmy Carter and the beginning of the Ronald Reagan presidency. We see this gap emerge, right, from around 1978. And it looks like hourly compensation tracked productivity growth exactly, basically, from 1948 until about 1980. But at that point, hourly compensation and wages have stagnated. And there's a lot of reasons for this. One is some of the policies that have been put in place. One of them is the government has sort of allowed this to happen, right? There have been very few minimum wage bumps. They almost only ever happen under a Democratic president. Even when they do happen, they're really low already compared to the average wage. And so wages are not tracking inflation, nor are they tracking productivity. And this is something that the American labor is pretty frustrated with. Another reason for this is the death of unions in America. Reagan basically killed unions when he got in a fight with the American not the American Airlines, but the American airline industry, not the literal company which was part of it, but the entire industry. Reagan basically fired all of them and said that the replacement employees can come in and take their jobs. A lot of states at that point basically started banning unions and fighting back against unions. Big businesses saw an opportunity to take down one of their biggest competitors, not even competitors, but their biggest advocates for their own employees. And so big business, while they have millions and millions of dollars to defend themselves and to fight in courts and to buy advertising, etc., labor is shrinking, and labor has less and less resources to push back against corporate interests. And so this is one of the big differences between the American society and the European society, is that labor unions are strong in Europe. And in Europe, they generally make about the same or more per capita. They live longer. They have a lot more vacation time. So this is something to think about. A lot of people say that unions are a bad thing, and of course they can be. They can take it too far, right? But so can corporate interests. And when only corporate interests are the ones who are allowed to defend themselves in courts or in the public sphere, it seems like there's been an imbalance, and we're seeing the effect of that imbalance. So just understand that this productivity increase, which almost always tracks directly with wages, in America it doesn't work like that, and this is one of the main reasons that we've seen this enormous growth in inequality in the American system that we haven't seen in the rest of the sort of developed economies in the world. All right, section 7.3, components of economic growth. There are three components. This is physical capital. So this is going to be infrastructure. This is all of the stuff that contributes to economic output. This might be roads and bridges. It might be computers. It could be factories. It could be research facilities. It's all kinds of physical capital that you can touch, right? And you can increase both the quantity of your infrastructure or your physical capital. You can have lots and lots and lots of new roads, or you can increase the quality. We can say we're going to replace our computer systems, but we're going to replace them with vastly superior computers. So it can go either way. The second one is human capital. So the first component of economic growth is physical capital. The second is human capital. This is largely education and training. This is about your workforce. It's also healthcare. If you're not healthy, you can't produce. So this is your human capital. This is going to be your education systems, your university systems. In some states, they don't really even have sort of an intermediate or high school level. They're still trying to work on, universal primary care, just getting people through the 6th grade or whatever. And so, we can't always think in the American mindset. In some places, this isn't about moving from a master's degree to a PhD. This is moving from, like, girls don't go to school to now they might be able to read. kind of thing, which can get you a huge bump in your GDP, which we'll talk about later too. The sort of difference in returns between a poor and a rich state that you get on investing in these things. The third is technology. So components of economic growth, again, one is physical capital, two is human capital, the third is technology. This can be lots of different things. This can be new knowledge, like we talked about earlier, research from the university set or from the private side. It can be new products, taking that research stuff and innovating into new products or new ways to develop products or new techniques to create those products. It can also just be innovations in logistics chains, right? This is where Walmart has been so successful, is that they revolutionized the logistics chains across the world, and they saved vast amounts of money in shipping and supplying and stocking and inventorying, rather than in actually reducing the cost of their products. They innovated the way that they delivered and put on the shelves and stored and bought, and the business world, I think, was sort of amazed at first at just how profitable that became at sort of reducing the cost side instead of increasing the profit side. Walmart innovated reducing that cost side through technology and innovation in logistics, which was remarkable at the time. And now the U.S. government and the U.S. military and retailers around the world are studying what Walmart did in putting their products on the shelves, delivering those products, these sorts of things. So it's pretty cool stuff. And then last is factory layouts. This is kind of a new thing. The idea that you can make your factory layout as efficient as humanly possible, right? If I'm on a lathe and I just need to turn around to get to this new machine where I can sort of grind it down some, instead of having to walk halfway across the factory to where the grinders are and back to my lathe, now we can make efficiencies in laying out where the physical capital is on our plot of land, right? And make it really efficient for workers to move, to do the few necessary steps they need to make. Even that can be a technological innovation, right? So there's a lot of ways to think about how we can increase economic growth. There's so many different facets to it. I just want you to sort of think about how this works and to think about all of the different approaches you can take to increasing growth in your economy or in your firm, etc. We got a new definition here. Capital deepening is just the idea of when a society increases the level of capital per person in that society, right? So maybe we're adding schools to our society. Maybe we're investing more in university education systems. Maybe we're building new roads. Maybe we're building an infrastructure system. I mean, not an infrastructure, but a interstate system, which was a really massive project that President Eisenhower put in place in the 1950s, that truly helped America to just explode post-war, because now we have this, basically it helped to make the logistics and supply chain efficient, like we were just talking about with Walmart. Now we have these beautiful roads that go from coast to coast, north to south, that both our military and our private citizens can use, and it made the ability to create new markets and to deliver to new markets possible, and it helped to expand the United States economy dramatically in the 1950s and 60s. I did want to make this point that the book makes, and I'm going to read it word for word. A general orientation towards markets does not rule out important roles for government. There are times when markets fail to allocate capital or technology in a manner that provides the greatest benefit for society as a whole. The government's role is to correct these failures. In addition, government can guide or influence markets towards certain outcomes. There's been a push, and there's always been a push for the idea that government is useless, right? And that government is inefficient, and that government can't do anything right, or that government isn't necessary, or that the only thing the government needs to provide is police and a military. That's not true. It's patently false, and it's misinformed. The government is necessary to do a lot of things. It's necessary, in a sense, to provide a social safety net for the very elderly and the very young. We have to have roads and infrastructure which cannot be provided efficiently by the private market. We need an education system because if you educate, it helps everyone in your society by lifting the human capital, increasing the likelihood of technological innovation, increasing the information in your society. We need healthcare. And I don't necessarily mean that we need it socialized. I don't know that or not. But the government has to provide some sort of health care in emergency situations for their own soldiers. So the government has to or can provide a function for research, right? It's hard to convince people that we need research for all kinds of different things, from drought-resistant crops to new research on materials science to research on, how to reduce, I don't know, what's something that's hot right now? How to reduce trauma in kids who are having to quarantine for a year. The private market doesn't really provide an incentive for those things, or a product to be sold in the long run, right? There are also some things that are really touchy, like AIDS research, which the pharmaceutical companies didn't really want to get involved in the 1980s and 90s because there was so much misunderstanding and hatred toward those who had contracted AIDS, even for some of whom had nothing to do with sex, say. They had a blood transfusion, or they had a surgery that got botched because blood got mixed in. And the government needs to be able to step in and prevent further infection from happening and create ways to help those people get through their disease. And the private side wasn't doing it because they were afraid that people would stop buying their other products if they helped homosexuals, in a sense. So there are a lot of different ways that the government needs to be involved in our lives. There are discussions as to how far they need to get involved and which areas they need to get involved in, but I think it's rather misinformed to claim that we don't need a government. Anarchy is not an answer to anything. And go look at Rwanda in their civil war, or Pol Pot. You don't want to live in a society like that, I promise you. So be careful about what you say about, we don't need government at all. That's not true. Bureaucracy, actually, there's a really interesting book on development and on growth and on what makes a nation state. Anyways, the guy's name is Francis Fukuyama. He's a professor from Stanford University, and he says that bureaucracy actually was the start of civilization, that we couldn't really have civilization without a bureaucracy, without some way of structuring our society. So I guess my point is just government is necessary. We can debate how big it needs to be or what fields it needs to be involved in, but I think it's pretty silly to suggest that we don't need government. Section 7.4, economic convergence. This is the idea that poor countries sort of converge at their own growth rate, whereas rich countries sort of converge at their own growth rate. Rich countries tend to grow at a clip of about 2 to 3% per annum on average. Whereas a lot of the sort of fast-moving, at least developing countries, like the BRICS countries, BRICS, which is an acronym for Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. These countries, which are sort of the up-and-coming developing countries, they're growing at anywhere from 7 to 11%, which is massive, right? Why is this? The book says part of it is diminishing return. The idea that you're going to deepen your economy, or that you're going to add more infrastructure, or that you're going to see a huge boost from education, you already have all that stuff in a developed country. And so now you're just really tinkering at the margins. And so while you need to make it as efficient as possible and invest in the right ways, you're never really going to be able to get to that 10% growth rate, right? Because the difference between moving your society from 1 year of college to a second year of college on average, say, instead of moving your society from a third grade to a sixth grade education, that's a huge difference, right? And you're going to get an enormous human capital return on this sort of fourth to sixth grade movement in your society than you are from this 1 year of college to a second year of college. You're not going to get as much return on that, right? The same for infrastructure. America and the developed countries already have massive infrastructures and infrastructure projects in place. And so adding another $1 billion to infrastructure in Germany versus adding another $1 billion to infrastructure in, Senegal is going to be completely different. You're going to get an enormous return on your investment from Senegal, and you're going to get a slight return on your investment in Germany. So they're very different societies, and there's only so much you can do at the margins versus we're trying to rebuild our entire society and sort of come up to match you. There's also, technology is just easier and cheaper to update than it is to advance, right? The industrialized nations are trying to do research at the margins too, whereas, say, Senegal, they don't need groundbreaking technology. They just need technology. And so it's a lot easier to institute technology that already exists and to receive returns on that technology, which becomes cheaper every day as we're developing new ones, than it is to develop a new technology and implement it, right? Which is incredibly expensive and incredibly taxing on human capital and on labor capital. So again, you're getting a diminishing return. There's just not as much there, marginal return, I should say. There's also a suggestion that some of these countries simply learn from the mistakes of other countries, right? America, England, Norway, whatever, have already been through the trials and tribulations of becoming a developed state. Brazil has already shown the flat-out impoverishment of the idea of import substitution industrialization, ISI. So other states can learn from the mistakes that have come before them and ensure that they don't put their own foot in it, right? And they're going to make mistakes too, but they won't make as many as those who have come before. Lastly, I would suggest, the book didn't say anything about it, but I would say that international or intellectual property theft is increasing. The advent of the internet and the ease of sharing and disseminating information and the seemingly vast networks of industrial espionage have increased dramatically, right? And so you're seeing intellectual theft on a grand scale. And so a lot of these countries that are trying to develop, not only is it cheaper and easier to implement implement technologies that already exist, but you might be able to even steal them and not have to pay for the proprietary information, right? And you might even be able to steal the most groundbreaking technology that the European countries or America is putting out from DARPA, say, and bring it back to your own state. And now you didn't have to put in the human capital or the labor or the investiture necessary to make that groundbreaking innovation, but you get all of the benefits from it. And so this is a real problem that we're going to have to really approach in the next 10 to 15 years, especially with China and some of the other rising countries like Russia and Brazil. There's a lot of intellectual property theft going on in the world, and it's reducing the cost of other countries to catch up to us, but it's also reducing our incentive to do groundbreaking research, because now we can't monetize it, which is a problem, because then our society starts to fall back. And I don't really know how to fix this at this point, but it's something that we need to be talking about, and it's something that sort of ethicists and technologists and economists and political scientists and politicians all need to get into the same room and hash this stuff out. What do we do about intellectual property theft? Because we can't just keep going forward and losing all our investments, and we can't disincentivize future research, right? Because then we're just going to stagnate. So it's a real problem. Okay, that's the chapter. I want to add my own piece at the end here about how do we account for the differences between countries and between regions? And we've touched on some of this. The book is very focused on how does a state grow, right? And that's a great thing to learn about. But I want to talk about how do we account for the differences between growth patterns between states, because I'm sort of a comparative economist, comparative political scientist. I like looking at the international scene rather than just one state. So we got a lot of different things here. At the bottom, I touch on national policy, and we touched on a little bit of this before. Asia implemented a policy of export industrialization, where they're building facilities and economic pieces and industries that focus on exporting goods. They also invested heavily in education and in healthcare, because they saw the human capital piece as the most important. And this is what we've seen across much of the sort of Eastern Asian bloc. Vietnam, at least the successful ones, South Korea, Vietnam, Japan, these sort of states that are sort of the archetype for what we would like to see in growth over time. South Korea was one of the poorest countries on earth 60 or 70 years ago, and now they're one of the richest countries on earth. That is a marvel. And a lot of countries would love to have copied that, but haven't, and failed pretty miserably. And these are some of the reasons why, right? They invested in their human capital. They invested in social medicine, I'll say it, to make sure that everybody's safe and healthy and can go to work, and is healthy mentally too. And also they invested in education heavily. And they went from like a third grade average education in 1950, when they were in the midst of their civil war, to they're pumping out some of the best research on the planet in the most important fields, from economics to materials science to computer science. They've truly done something remarkable, and so don't just poo-poo their experience. There's something to be learned there. South America, on the other hand, instead of investing in their human capital, they invested in their capital. They built a bunch of factories. They invested in import substitution to try to build their own internal economy. And they also invested in the military, which turned out to be a piss poor idea, because many of those militaries took over the state eventually in the late 1960s, early 1970s, and a couple times in the 1980s. And even recently, in the last 5 years or so, we've seen a couple of moves like this. So I don't know that investing in your military and in factories versus your human capital piece is the answer. And it appears, at least statistically and from a theoretical perspective, that it's the exact wrong thing to do. So maybe America should revisit some of its expenditures is what I guess I'm getting to. There's also the resource curse, right? The resource curse has been the monkey on the backs of Africa for a long, long time. The fact that they have these beautiful resources like diamonds and gold and oil and, enter your resource here. Amber, emeralds, sapphires. I mean, it's all in Africa, right? Unfortunately, this has meant that the leaders don't need to build a bureaucracy. They don't need a modern state. Instead of trying to extract taxes through growth and through development, instead they just steal resources from the ground. They ignore their people almost completely. They line their own pockets. They're vastly involved in corruption and nepotism. It's pretty bad stuff, and it's really strange, right? Because you would think that this resource, like having oil in your country, would be a huge boon. Like you have this resource, you have money coming in, you can spend it, you can invest it in your country. That doesn't happen. Instead, what happens is the cronies take over. They take all of the resources. They ignore the people's needs. They don't devolve political power to the people. And eventually you end up getting civil wars and riots and assassinations. And it's just really bad stuff. So the resource curse is a real problem. And it's something that Asian countries don't really have. They don't really have resources. They don't have gold or diamonds or oil. Africa and Latin America does, and it has been a surprising penalty for them. What else do we have here? Wallerstein's theory of the periphery. This is a really interesting theory that came out in the 80s and 90s and is still discussed today. Wallerstein suggests that the industrialized rich nations are simply racist asses and they're forcing the second and third tier nations to be second and third tier nations for the long run, right? They are actively involved in ensuring that these nations don't actually come up and close the gap and become first world countries. There is some suggestive evidence, especially in sort of the 1960s and 1970s, in the way that the United States treated South America, the Dulles brothers, who are both on the corporate board of the United Fruit Company and also high-level policymakers in the United States government, sort of forcing states to sell them their goods at almost nothing and then selling them in the American market and getting rich, extracting resources from these countries. There's some really interesting stuff there. So if you're interested, his name is Wallerstein. I should have put in a citation and I forgot, but if you're interested, please email me or whatever. I'll get it to you. I'll find it. It's a really cool book. I don't know that he's right necessarily. I think there's some problems with it, but he did have some interesting points to make. What else do we have? Rule of law. Rule of law is just absolutely vital. I think this may be the most important aspect about differentiating countries and how well they have developed over time. This is another thing that the Asian states have and the European states have that other countries don't. They have an independent and generally non-corrupted judicial system that can hold all citizens equally accountable, whether they be rich or poor, leader or beggar. Of course, there are some issues there, right? In every country, there's probably going to be a bit of going easy on the on the rich and the leaders, right? We'll talk a little bit about that. But the rule of law has been absolutely vital to the idea of growth because it's vital to the market system, right? If you don't have property rights and you don't have contractual rights in place, how is your economy ever going to even really exist, much less grow? You're going to have this enormous black market economy going on. You're going to have distrust in the system. You're going to have people just rapaciously breaking their contracts and screwing over sort of the little guy or their lender or whomever. So you must have a rule of law in place, an independent judicial system that treats all people equally. And this is one of the problems with the American system right now, and one of the problems with why people are so frustrated, at least the normal everyday American is so frustrated with the economic system, is that a lot of these guys are getting away with murder. I just saw today, this morning, or maybe yesterday, they announced that the SEC just busted another company for a new Ponzi scheme of over $1.7 billion. We have laws on the books. We just haven't enforced them because these people are rich and powerful. We just need to get back to enforcing them, and I think it would help to reduce some of the frustration and distrust in the American system. There are also differences in infrastructure. We talked a little bit about this when we talked about Africa, post-colonial Africa, the difference between actual urbanization and development versus just trying to build a centralized way of extracting resources, right? So that didn't really help in Africa, whereas in Asia and other states we saw actual infrastructure projects meant to help everyone, not just this sort of colonial state. All right, I think that's enough for now. This has gone pretty long, so I truly appreciate you sitting with me. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope I got you thinking about a lot of different things. I'm sure you're not going to agree with me about everything, and you'll agree with me about some other things, but I really want to just get you guys thinking. So have a wonderful day. Thanks for working so hard. Stay happy and healthy, okay? Bye.